I want to be clear about something before I start. I have been a security sergeant for 11 years. I have guarded 3 ambassadors, 2 sitting Earth presidents, and 1 very paranoid Thalian trade minister who wore body armor to breakfast. I have seen things that would make most people quit their jobs and move somewhere quiet, maybe raise goats. Nothing, and I mean nothing, in my entire career prepared me for that Tuesday morning. Let me back up. The request came in on a Thursday. Our embassy director, Ambassador Helena Marsh, called a full staff briefing at 600 hours. She walked in looking the way she always does when something enormous is about to land on her desk, calm, composed, with that specific tension behind her eyes that she thinks nobody notices. We all notice. We've worked with her for years. She said very simply, His Imperial Majesty, Kael'thar Vos III, sovereign of the Vorath Dominion, will be visiting this embassy for a diplomatic breakfast on Tuesday. And then she waited. There was silence for about 4 seconds. Then Lieutenant Marcus Webb, who has been with the embassy since its founding and who I think has never in his life been surprised by anything, said, very quietly, "The Vorath Dominion." "Yes," Ambassador Marsh said. "As in, the Vorath Dominion that has not made official diplomatic contact with any human installation in 31 years. That Vorath Dominion." "That is the one, yes." Another silence. "And their king," Webb said. "He's coming here to breakfast." "Correct." Webb looked at his coffee mug. Then he set it down very carefully on the table, like he was afraid of it. "I'm going to need more of this," he said. That was, looking back, a deeply ironic statement. Let me tell you about the Vorath Dominion, in case you've been living under a rock or you're reading this from one of the outer rim settlements where news travels slow. The Vorath are one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in this sector of the galaxy. They've been out there longer than humans figured out that the Earth goes around the sun. Their empire spans 14 star systems and something like 42 inhabited planets, depending on which census you're reading and how generous you want to be with the definition of inhabited. They are, to put it plainly, enormous, not just politically, physically enormous. The average Vorath stands about 9 feet tall, with a body structure that's somewhere between what you'd get if a panther and a mountain decided to collaborate on a project. They're bipedal, bilateral, with 4 upper limbs, 2 for heavy work, 2 for precision, and a cranial structure that houses a brain with processing capacity that, according to our xenobiologists, is approximately 3 times that of an average human. They are also deeply, fundamentally arrogant, not the kind of arrogance that comes from insecurity, the real kind, the kind that comes from being actually, objectively superior to most things you've ever encountered and knowing it, and having had that confirmed over and over again for about 12,000 years. They had not been in contact with the human diplomatic corps for 31 years because, according to their last official communication, they had found humanity to be insufficiently evolved for sustained diplomatic engagement. That communication had arrived via courier drone. There had been no response requested and no return address included. So when King Kael'thar Vos III decided he wanted a diplomatic breakfast at the human embassy on Nexus Station Velorath, nobody could quite figure out why. Our intelligence people had theories. None of them turned out to be right. The truth was stranger, and we'll get to that. We spent 4 days preparing. I mean that in the most comprehensive sense possible. Every inch of the embassy's east dining chamber was inspected, re-inspected, and then inspected again by people who had already done 2 inspections. The kitchen went through 7 rounds of review by both our standard food safety teams and a specialist xenobiology unit that we brought in from the Velorath Science Station. The menu was the first crisis. See, Vorath biology is compatible enough with human food that they can eat most of what we eat without dying. This was actually confirmed during the very brief period of contact 31 years ago, before the relationship soured. What we didn't know was what any individual Vorath actually liked to eat, because that data was considered culturally proprietary, and the Vorath had never shared it. Ambassador Marsh made the call to serve a standard diplomatic breakfast. "We welcome them into our space, our culture, our traditions," she said. "We don't try to Vorathify our kitchen. That's either pandering or presumption, and I won't do either." She was right. As it turned out, she was exactly right, just not for the reasons she expected. The menu was eggs prepared 3 ways, fresh bread from the embassy's own small bakery, fruit from the hydroponics bay, and coffee. There was a whole separate conversation about the coffee. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, our lead xenobiologist, pulled me aside on Friday afternoon and said, "Sergeant, I need you to understand something about Vorath biochemistry and caffeine." I said, "That sounds like the beginning of a sentence that ends with 'don't serve them coffee.'" She looked at me with an expression that I would describe as tortured professional uncertainty. "Their biochemistry doesn't process caffeine the way ours does. We believe, and I want to stress that word believe, that caffeine is inert in their system. Not harmful, just inert, like water with flavor." "So it's safe?" "Almost certainly." "Yuki." "The probability of any adverse reaction is incredibly low. We're talking theoretical. The issue is we have almost no empirical data, because no human has ever actually served coffee to a high-ranking Vorath in a controlled setting." "Until Tuesday." "Until Tuesday," she confirmed. "Should we just not serve coffee?" She considered this for a moment. Ambassador Marsh said no substitutions. She doesn't want them to feel like we altered our culture for them. She said that's the kind of thing that reads as weakness to the Vorath diplomatic mindset. I rubbed my face. "Okay," I said. "Okay, it's probably fine." "Almost certainly fine," Yuki said, which was not quite the same thing. Monday night I barely slept. Not because I was worried about security. My team had the building locked down better than I've ever locked anything down in my career. 14 security personnel, 6 of whom were in plain clothes. 3 independent monitoring systems running simultaneously, coordinated with Nexus Station security for outer perimeter support. I was awake because of something I couldn't quite explain. Some instinct that had kept me alive through 11 years of this job was whispering at the back of my skull. I kept running the variables. The Vorath King's team had sent an incredibly detailed advance brief, dietary tolerances, environmental preferences, protocol expectations, translation specifications. It was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they have thought about every conceivable complication. Except they hadn't asked us a single question about our menu. I didn't know why that bothered me, but it did. I was still thinking about it when my alarm went off at 4:30 Tuesday morning. I got dressed, drank my coffee, 2 cups, which I do not usually allow myself before a major security event, and went to work. King Kelthar Voss arrived at 8:47 hours. He arrived with a retinue of 9. 2 personal bodyguards who made my 6'2" frame feel genuinely small for the first time in my adult life. 1 personal physician, 1 protocol officer, 2 cultural advisors, 1 translator, 1 silent individual whose role was never clearly explained, and who I privately designated the mystery, and 1 junior aide who looked absolutely terrified and whom I recognized in retrospect as probably being someone's first diplomatic posting. The king himself walked in last, which is Vorath protocol. The retinue enters and establishes the space before the sovereign moves through it. He had to turn sideways slightly to clear the doorway, not because he was too wide, but because the angle of his secondary limbs made straight entry geometrically awkward. Our facilities team had actually measured this specific problem in advance and had already confirmed the door clearance was technically adequate. It was, but it was close. I was stationed near the dining chamber entrance, I saw him up close as he passed. 9 feet and 2 inches. I know this exactly because we had his dimensions on file. Silver-gray scales arranged in overlapping geometric patterns across the upper body, fading to a smoky charcoal along the flanks. Eyes that were, and I want to be precise here, not frightening, exactly, but comprehensive. Like they were processing everything in the room simultaneously and ranking it in order of importance. He swept the room the way a lighthouse sweeps the sea. Slowly, systematically, and without any particular hurry. When those eyes passed over me, I had the very specific sensation of being filed. Then he turned to Ambassador Marsh, who was standing at the table to receive him, and he said something in Vorath. The translator, a compact, gray-furred individual named Pelris Tan, who had apparently been doing Vorath translation for 20 years, rendered it as, "Your facility is acceptable." Ambassador Marsh smiled. She had been briefed on Vorath diplomatic language, and she knew that acceptable from a Vorath sovereign is the equivalent of magnificent from most other species. She inclined her head in the specific gesture that the protocol team had determined would read as respectful without being submissive. "Your presence honors it," she said. Pelris translated. The king considered this response for a moment, then made a small gesture with his upper right limb that apparently conveyed something positive, because his protocol officer visibly relaxed. They sat down. And then, about 4 minutes later, one of the embassy's kitchen staff, a young man named Donovan, who had been with us for 8 months, and who was genuinely excellent at his job, walked into the dining chamber with a carafe of coffee. Testimony of Donovan Elias Morrow. Human Embassy Kitchen Staff, Grade 2. Recorded, March 28, 2387, 14 days after the incident. I want to start by saying I followed the protocol exactly. Exactly. I had been briefed 3 times. 3 times. Once by Chef Akafer, once by the protocol team, and once by a security person whose name I didn't catch, who basically stood in my kitchen and watched me practice carrying a carafe across a room for 20 minutes. My job was simple: walk in, offer coffee. If the Vorath delegation indicated no interest, thank them and retreat. If they indicated interest, pour the coffee at the table from the carafe, place the cup in front of the relevant individual, and back away. I had practiced the pour. I am not joking. I practiced it in the kitchen for an entire afternoon the day before. How to hold the carafe, the angle, the amount, because too much coffee in a cup can read as imposing in certain diplomatic contexts, I was told. 2/3 full, slight pause, set the carafe down on the side tray. I was ready. I walked in with the carafe. I stood at the service position. The translator did a brief announcement, explaining what coffee was, which I thought was interesting because I assumed they had data on human beverages, but apparently offering a verbal explanation was part of the cultural courtesy protocol. I poured coffee for Ambassador Marsh first, as instructed, then for Deputy Ambassador Chen, then for the 3 human cultural advisors at the table. We all expected that the Vorath delegation would decline. That had been the consensus prediction in the kitchen. They'll watch us drink it and use it as a data point, Chef Akafer had said. That's what the Vorath do. They observe before they participate. So when the king's cultural advisor said something to Pelris, and Pelris turned to me and said, "His Imperial Majesty would like to try a cup," I froze for about 1 full second. Just 1 second, then training kicked in. I poured the cup. 2/3 full, slight pause, set the carafe on the side tray. I placed the cup in front of the king, which meant I had to stand very close to him, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body, which was significant and immediately noticeable. Vorath run warm, much warmer than humans. I stepped back. The king looked at the cup. He didn't pick it up immediately. He studied it. I watched his eyes, all four of them, because Voreth have four eyes arranged in a slightly wider configuration than human eyes, tracking across the surface of the liquid. His nostrils did something, a very controlled, precise inhalation. His reaction to the smell was subtle, almost invisible, but I was standing right there and I saw it. The faintest narrowing around the uppermost pair of eyes, not distaste, more like surprise, like the smell was something he hadn't anticipated. Then he picked up the cup. His hands, the precision pair, are proportionally elegant for his size. Long, tapered fingers. He picked up the cup with complete steadiness. He took one sip. And then everything got very strange very quickly. I have been a Voreth translator for 22 years. I have translated in 43 different diplomatic contexts, 6 of which involved situations that could be classified as crises. I have a professional reputation for composure. I nearly lost it that morning. I want the record to reflect that what happened was genuinely unprecedented, and that my delayed response to the king's initial vocalization was not incompetence but honest confusion, because the combination of words he used had no precedent in my Voreth diplomatic phrase library, and I needed approximately 3 seconds to parse what he was actually saying. Here is what happened. The king took the sip. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, normal processing time for a novel taste experience, nothing unusual. Then his eyes changed. I don't mean metaphorically. Voreth eyes have a physiological response to certain stimuli. The iris expands and contracts in ways that are often visible and communicative. His pupils, all four, dilated simultaneously and significantly. Then he set the cup down. Not dropped it, set it, with tremendous control, but his movements in the next few seconds had a quality I had not seen in a Voreth sovereign in 22 years of translation, a quality I would describe as contained alarm. He turned to his personal physician, a tall, thin Voreth named Dreth Akavis, and spoke 4 words. The literal translation of those 4 words is, "It is moving inside." The physician's response was instantaneous and significant. He stood up from his chair. He reached for something at his belt, which my security counterparts later described as causing approximately 3 seconds of genuine crisis, as the item reached for turned out to be a medical scanner and not a weapon, but those 3 seconds were notable. The king spoke again. More words now, faster, still controlled, but the control clearly costing him something. He was describing in real time what he was experiencing. My translation was running about 3 seconds behind because the speed and the content were both unusual. He said, "There is a sensation of accelerated perception. The room is becoming brighter. There is warmth moving from my primary stomach upward through my neural pathway. My secondary hands are registering a low-frequency vibration I cannot locate the source of. These are the preliminary characteristics of a Deathvirus compound exposure." Deathvirus is a Voreth neurotoxin, a real one, naturally occurring in several plants native to the Voreth home system. It was used historically as a method of political assassination. The early-stage symptoms include, according to Voreth medical literature, heightened sensory perception, spreading warmth, mild tremor in the extremities. The king believed, in that moment, absolutely sincerely believed, that someone had put poison in his coffee. I started talking very quickly. Testimony of Dr. Yukitanaka. I was not in the dining chamber when it happened. I was in my office 3 corridors away, running a background monitor on the biomedical feeds we had set up in the dining chamber as a standard precaution for high-level meetings. My job was essentially to watch numbers and ensure nobody was having an unexpected medical event. The biomedical feed for the Voreth delegation was courtesy monitoring only. They had consented to basic vital sign tracking as part of the security agreement. And when the king's cardiovascular data started doing something interesting, I was the first person in the building to see it on a screen. His heart rate, which in Vorath is measured differently than human heart rate, and I want to be clear that I was watching equivalent values, translated through our xenobiological conversion model, jumped approximately 30% in the space of about 8 seconds. I stared at my screen. Then I watched his neural activity indicators, which we were pulling from a surface sensor in his chair. They had agreed to this as part of the security package. Do something I had genuinely never seen in a Vorath reading before. Caffeine in the Vorath system is not, as I had told Sergeant Vasquez, entirely inert. I was wrong about that. Not dangerously wrong. Not wrong in a way that caused actual harm, but wrong. The issue is that the Vorath endocannabinoid system, their equivalent of our central nervous system's regulatory infrastructure, interacts with caffeine in a fundamentally different way than the human system does. In humans, caffeine primarily works by blocking adenosine receptors, creating that familiar sensation of alertness. In Vorath, caffeine doesn't interact with adenosine receptors at all. Their receptor configuration is different. Instead, it triggers a cascade effect in their equivalent of the noradrenergic system. The result is not a gentle, pleasant alertness. The result is a sudden, sharp, full-body activation event, every sensory system simultaneously jumping to heightened output, heart rate spike, peripheral nervous system lighting up. A profound sensation of warmth spreading outward from the digestive system. From the inside, for a being who has never encountered this before, with no reference point for what it is, I can only imagine it feels like being hit with something. Something that moves through you fast and changes everything in the span of a single breath. I was already running to the dining chamber when the alert from Sergeant Vasquez hit my communicator. Testimony of Ambassador Helena Marsh. I have been an ambassador for 16 years. I have navigated trade disputes, species territorial conflicts, a genuine accidental war that started because of a mistranslated word for fish, and one memorable occasion where a visiting dignitary ate something that turned out to be decorative and not, as they had assumed, an appetizer. Nothing in those 16 years had prepared me for watching the sovereign of the Vorath Dominion stand up from his chair, turn to his personal physician, and announce what, I did not yet know, he believed to be an assassination attempt. I knew something was wrong before Pelris caught up with the translation. The physical cues were impossible to miss. The king had set his cup down with a very specific carefulness. His physician had stood up suddenly. The two bodyguards had moved, not dramatically, not with aggression, just repositioned, the way that security professionals reposition when something shifts in the environment. Subtle and devastating. The king's cultural advisor turned to me. His expression was unreadable in the way that Vorath expressions are always technically unreadable, but there was something in the set of his secondary limbs that I had been trained to recognize as elevated tension. Then Pelris started translating, and the bottom fell out of my morning. His Imperial Majesty reports experiencing symptoms consistent with death virus exposure, Pelris said, very carefully, very professionally, while I watched his professional composure take what appeared to be genuine structural damage. He is requesting clarification regarding the composition of the beverage. I said probably too quickly, "It's coffee." Pelris translated. The king said something. He says he requires the specific chemical composition, Pelris said. I turned to the side where Deputy Ambassador Chen was already on his communicator. "Get Yuki in here," he said quietly, "right now." Meanwhile, I looked at the king. I looked at him directly, which is technically a form of diplomatic assertion in Vorath culture. Meeting the gaze of a sovereign without invitation reads as a claim of equal standing. I did it anyway. It wasn't calculated. It was instinct. When someone across a table thinks they've been poisoned and they're trying to remain calm about it, and you need them to stay calm, you look them in the eye. His 4 eyes met mine. I said clearly and calmly, "Your Majesty, I give you my personal guarantee that nothing in that cup was intended to cause harm. I am going to have our medical expert here in under 2 minutes. You are safe in this room." Pelris translated. I watched the king's face. He didn't relax, but he didn't escalate. He did something that I later learned was a significant act of self-control for a Vorath sovereign. He sat back down in his chair, folded his 4 hands together on the table, and waited. Those were the longest 90 seconds of my career. Testimony of Sergeant Elena Vasquez continued. I was managing 3 crises simultaneously. The first was the king, who was sitting at the table with the contained energy of a very large, very powerful being who was genuinely uncertain whether they were dying and was choosing, through what I can only describe as extraordinary discipline, not to act on that uncertainty yet. The second was his bodyguards, who had not drawn anything and were not making any threatening movements, but whose entire posture had shifted to a configuration that my training registered as pre-engagement, not aggressive, ready. The third was my own people. I had 6 security personnel in that room, or immediately adjacent to it. Every single one of them had seen the same thing I had, the physician standing, the king's reaction, the bodyguards repositioning. Every single one of them was running the same calculations I was. Nobody moved. I want to put that on record, and I want it emphasized. Not one of my people moved inappropriately. Not one weapon was touched. Not one person took a step they hadn't been trained to take. They held. I moved to Sergeant Webb, who was at the north door, and I said, very quietly, "Tell me you're seeing what I'm seeing and tell me what you assess it as." He said, equally quietly, "I'm seeing a Vorath sovereign who thinks something is wrong with his beverage. I'm assessing it as a medical miscommunication, not a hostile action. His guards are in elevated posture, but they're following his lead. As long as he stays calm, they stay calm." "He's staying calm," I said. "Then so are we." I have worked with Webb for 6 years, and that exchange is the best 60 seconds of professional partnership I have ever experienced. Dr. Tanaka came through the door at a pace that was technically not quite running. She had a medical scanner in her hand, and a look on her face that was the expression of someone who has realized they were slightly wrong about something, and is dealing with the consequences of that at high velocity. She crossed the room, stopped at a respectful distance from the king, and spoke to Pelris. "I need to explain something," she said. "Can you translate as I speak? Don't wait for me to finish, keep up as I go." Pelris nodded. Yuki turned to the king. "Your Majesty, the beverage you consumed is called coffee. It is brewed from a plant native to the human home world, Earth. It contains a compound called caffeine. In humans, caffeine produces mild alertness. We had data suggesting caffeine was inert in Vorath biochemistry. That data was incomplete. I believe what you are experiencing is a caffeine response, an activation of your noradrenergic equivalent system. It is not a toxin. It is not harmful. The sensation will peak in approximately 3 to 5 minutes, and will then begin to subside over the following 15 to 20 minutes. She held up her scanner. "With your permission, I would like to take a reading to confirm." Pelris translated. The king was quiet for a moment. Then he said something to his physician. His physician responded briefly. Then the king turned back to Yuki and made a gesture with his precision hand, a small, controlled movement that Pelris translated as, "Proceed." Yuki ran the scanner. She looked at the readings. Her expression did something complex: relief, confirmation, and a very carefully suppressed embarrassment. "His Majesty's vital indicators are consistent with a standard caffeine response for Vorath biochemistry," she said. "Everything I'm seeing is what I'd expect. There's no toxic compound, no pathological cascade. He's fine. He's just had caffeine. Pelris translated. The king was quiet for a very long moment. Then he looked at the cup of coffee, still sitting in front of him on the table. And he said something in Vorath that made Pelris Tan, veteran of 22 years of diplomatic translation, put a hand briefly over his mouth. What did he say? Ambassador Marsh asked. Pelris cleared his throat. He said with tremendous professional dignity, His Imperial Majesty says approximately, this is what humans drink voluntarily, every day, of their own choosing. The next 20 minutes were, I'll be honest with you, they were the most professionally fascinating 20 minutes of my entire career. And I've had a career that included dissecting the digestive system of a greater Therian vault worm, which I had previously thought would be the highlight of my professional life. After Pelris translated the king's initial response and Ambassador Marsh confirmed, very calmly, very diplomatically, yes, humans do drink coffee every day, of their own choosing, the king did something I did not expect. He looked at the cup again. And then he looked at the humans at the table who were drinking coffee. He looked at Ambassador Marsh, who had her own cup in front of her. He looked at Deputy Ambassador Chen, who had been holding his cup the whole time with the kind of studied casualness that meant he was absolutely aware of the significance of every movement in that room. The king said something. Pelris translated, this compound produces that effect in your biology as well. Ambassador Marsh said, yes, a milder version we experience it as alertness, energy. Focus. The king considered this, and you consume it in the morning. Many of us do, yes. To begin the day. That's right. Another pause. The king's eyes moved to the window. We had a viewport in the dining chamber that looked out on the station's exterior and the stars beyond. He looked at the stars for a moment. Then he looked back at the cup. Humans, he said through Pelris, begin every day by voluntarily introducing a neurological activation compound into their systems. We do, Marsh said, because the natural state requires augmentation. There was a brief silence at the table. Chen was very carefully not smiling. We find it helps, Marsh said. The king considered this for another 3 or 4 seconds. Then he made a gesture to his physician. The physician looked deeply, profoundly unhappy about what he could apparently see coming. They had a brief conversation in Vorath that Pelris did not immediately translate. Pelris, Marsh said gently. Pelris translated. His Imperial Majesty is asking his physician whether the compound is safe for him to continue consuming in this sitting. His physician is explaining that the acute response has peaked and will subside, that there is no evidence of harm, and that continued consumption at this sitting would likely produce a sustained elevated state rather than an additional acute response. His Majesty is indicating that this is acceptable. He paused. His Majesty, Pelris continued, with what I can only describe as heroic neutrality, would like more coffee. Testimony of Donovanelis Morrow continued. When Sergeant Vasquez came back to the door and said, very quietly, Donovan, more coffee. Now, I thought I had misheard her. I said, I'm sorry. The king wants more coffee, she said. The king who just thought the first cup was poison. That is the one, yes. I went and got the carafe. This time when I walked in, the energy in the room was completely different. It wasn't exactly relaxed. There's no universe in which a room with a Vorath king and his bodyguards and a full diplomatic team on both sides is genuinely relaxed. But it had shifted from the particular tension that I can only describe as, is someone about to die, to something more like, we have stepped into genuinely unusual territory, and everyone is proceeding cautiously and with great interest. I poured the king his second cup. He watched me pour it, watched the coffee come out of the carafe, watched it fill the cup. He leaned forward slightly, just slightly, and smelled it again. This time there was no surprise. He recognized it. His expression, as much as I could read it, was something between curiosity and the look a scientist gets when they're running an experiment they already know is going to produce interesting results. He picked up the cup. He took a second sip. This one was longer than the first, more considered. His physician made a small sound that, in any species in any language, is clearly the sound of professional resignation. Testimony of PLRISTANN continued. The second cup changed the dynamic of the breakfast entirely. By the time the king had finished the second cup, the acute response had peaked and was subsiding, as Dr. Tanaka had predicted, but what replaced it was different from what I expected. The king, and I want to be very careful about how I describe this, because anthropomorphizing Voreth emotional states is professionally problematic, and also because what I observed was genuinely subtle. The king seemed interested in a way he had not been when he walked in. Not caffeinated in the way a human might appear caffeinated, more heightened, alert. His attention, which had already been significant when he entered the room, was now sharper. He was following the conversation more closely. He was asking questions through me, where before he had been primarily listening and allowing his advisors to engage. The conversation shifted. It moved away from the planned diplomatic agenda, which had been about trade protocols and station access rights, and 2 or 3 dry but important procedural agreements, and it moved toward something nobody had planned for. The king asked how long humans had been drinking coffee. Ambassador Marsh answered, approximately 5,000 years of documented consumption, likely longer as oral tradition. He asked when they had discovered the physiological mechanism. She answered, the understanding of caffeine's mechanism developed relatively recently in human history, within the last 400 years of Earth time, though humans had understood the practical effects for millennia and consumed it regardless. He said, you consumed a compound that produced neurological effects for thousands of years before you understood the mechanism. Yes, Marsh said. He was quiet for a moment, without knowing whether it was safe. In the early period, yes. Another pause, and it became a central component of human daily life. For billions of people, yes. The king turned to his cultural advisor and said something. His cultural advisor responded briefly. Then the king turned back to Ambassador Marsh. Pelris translated. His Imperial Majesty says that humans are either very brave or very incautious. He is not yet certain which. Ambassador Marsh smiled, a real one, not the diplomatic variety. Honestly, Your Majesty, after 5,000 years, we're not entirely certain either. Testimony of Ambassador Helena Marsh continued. Here's the thing nobody outside that room understood when the reports started circulating. And here's what I want the record to show clearly. The coffee incident, which is what everyone calls it now, as if it were a diplomatic disaster, a near catastrophe, a failure of preparation, was actually the moment the breakfast stopped being a formal diplomatic engagement and became a real conversation. I have been an ambassador for 16 years. I have sat in more formal diplomatic breakfasts than I can count. They are almost invariably elegant, carefully orchestrated, professionally competent, and utterly sterile. Everyone is too polished. Everyone has too many handlers. The conversation moves along approved pathways like trains on established tracks, and you get from point A to point B efficiently and with no surprises. And you go home with a signed agreement and the slightly hollow feeling that comes from a day spent performing diplomacy rather than doing it. That morning, for about 90 seconds, everyone in that room was absolutely real. The king was genuinely alarmed. His people were genuinely concerned. My people were genuinely trying to help. And then, once the alarm passed, once Yuki had explained what was happening and the tension had drained out of the room, there was something left over, a residue, the kind of residue you get after a shared strange experience. We had all just been through something together, something small in the grand scale, but something real, and that changes a room. I watched the king look at his second cup of coffee, and I watched him decide to drink it anyway, knowing now exactly what it was going to do to him, choosing it with full information. And I thought, I understand this person more in this moment than I did 5 minutes ago. He's curious. He's genuinely deeply curious. That's why he came here, not for the trade protocols, not for the station access rights. He came because something about humans had finally gotten through the 31 years of determined diplomatic distance, and he wanted to look at us up close. And we handed him a cup of something he'd never encountered, and it knocked him sideways, and he got right back up and asked for more. I told my staff afterward privately, that is the best possible outcome from a worst possible scenario. That is diplomacy. Testimony of Dr. Yukitanaka continued. What happened in the last hour of the breakfast was something I will probably spend the rest of my career studying and writing about, and failing to fully capture. The king, on his second cup of coffee, asked to speak directly with me, not through the formal diplomatic framework. He asked, through Pelris, whether the embassy's xenobiologist would be willing to answer scientific questions about the compound. I said yes. Obviously, I said yes. We ended up having a 40-minute conversation, the king, Pelris, and me, with the rest of the room listening in various states of what I can only describe as careful astonishment, about caffeine, about human biology, about the co-evolutionary relationship between humans and the plants they cultivated. He asked why humans had so consistently sought out stimulant compound throughout their history. I explained the basics of adenosine and how caffeine blocking those receptors produces the experience of alertness. That when you're tired, your brain fills with adenosine, the fatigue signal, and caffeine prevents that signal from landing. So you feel alert even when the underlying physiological tiredness is still there. He sat with this for a moment. So the human experience of energy, he said through Pelris, is often manufactured. Sometimes, I said, yes. The alertness is real. The fatigue that underlies it is also real, and humans find the selective experience of only one of those things to be worth the deception. I'm not sure I'd call it deception, I said, more like management. He considered this. In Vorath biochemistry, he said, fatigue is information. We attend to it. Most Vorath sleep cycles average significantly longer than human sleep cycles, I said. We know this from the contact period data. Humans average 6 to 9 hours. Vorath average what would translate to approximately 14. Yes, he said. If you slept 14 hours and then woke up without caffeine, you probably wouldn't feel the need for it. A pause, then through Pelris, and if a human slept 14 hours, they'd probably still want coffee, I said honestly. And I watched something happen on the Vorath king's face, something subtle, something in the secondary eye muscles, that I think in a human would have been the beginnings of a laugh. Testimony of Sergeant Elena Vasquez continued. At 11:47 hours, the formal breakfast ended. The Vorath delegation prepared to depart. The king's protocol officer went through the standard leave-taking procedure, the formal words, the gestures, the acknowledgments. This is Vorath tradition, and it's quite long. Even the abbreviated diplomatic version runs about 6 minutes. Then the king himself addressed Ambassador Marsh directly. He said something. Pelris translated it, and his voice was very careful when he did it. His Imperial Majesty says, "Your people are not what we had calculated them to be. We had determined from the data available that humanity was an uncomplicated species with uncomplicated motivations. This morning has been a correction." Ambassador Marsh received this. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, We find ourselves frequently in the position of correcting people's assumptions about us, Your Majesty. It's something we've gotten used to. Pelris translated. The king listened. Then he said something brief, 1 or 2 words. Pelris, for the first time that entire morning, smiled. He said to Ambassador Marsh, he says, "Yes, I imagined so." The king turned. His retinue formed around him. They moved toward the door. At the door, the king stopped. He turned back, just slightly, a partial turn, because Voreth don't fully turn back when departing. It's a protocol thing, and he looked at the table, at the coffee cup still sitting there. He said something very quiet to his junior aide, who I had been privately thinking of all morning as the terrified one. The aide produced something from a carrying case, a small, flat data chip, and approached the table. He placed it next to Ambassador Marsh's coffee cup. Then he retreated rapidly, which confirmed my ongoing assessment of him. The king and his delegation left. Testimony of Ambassador Helena Marsh continued. The data chip contained, we discovered later when we finally read it. It took us 4 days of deliberation to decide whether to read it, because in diplomatic terms, an unannounced data chip from a sovereign's personal aide occupies a genuinely uncertain protocol space. The following. A request. Specifically, the Voreth Dominion's formal request to resume regular diplomatic contact with the human diplomatic corps, not a trade agreement, not a territorial negotiation, a request for ongoing dialogue. Attached to the formal request was a secondary document, personal rather than official. It came from the office of the king directly, signed with his personal cipher. It said, and I am translating from the formal rendering Pelris prepared for us, "The compound you call coffee, we would request a supply of it, for study. We believe its properties warrant investigation by our biochemical research division. We also acknowledge the irony that it took a neurotoxin scare to remember why conversation matters." I read this 3 times. Then I called Deputy Ambassador Chen into my office, and I said, "Marcus, go tell the kitchen staff we're shipping 200 kilograms of premium coffee beans to the Voreth Dominion." He looked at me. "It's diplomacy," I said. "People keep calling it the coffee incident, which I understand because events need names, and that's what happened to be at the center of it. But I want to say, for the historical record, that what we actually should be calling it is the conversation incident. Because the coffee was just the mechanism." Let me back up to the question of why Kael'thar Voss decided to come to our embassy in the first place. This had been puzzling our intelligence people since the invitation arrived. The Voreth had gone 31 years without contact. Then on a Thursday, we get a message saying their king wants to come to breakfast. Why? We found out about 2 months after the incident, through the subsequent diplomatic channel that the visit opened. There had been a junior Voreth diplomat, very junior, very young by Voreth standards, which means probably about 50 years old, who had been assigned to monitor human communications as an intelligence function. Standard practice, nothing unusual. His job was basically to read human media, intercept diplomatic traffic, and compile reports on human activities and capabilities. Somewhere along the line, he had encountered a recording. It was a piece of audio from a human radio program, a morning show, the kind of thing that humans broadcast for entertainment, not diplomacy. 2 humans talking about their morning, very casual, very ordinary. And at some point in this broadcast, one of the humans said something like, "I cannot function as a person until I've had my coffee. I don't even consider myself to have woken up yet." And the other one said, laughing, "I know, it's like the caffeine is what actually turns you on." This recording ended up in the intelligence report. The junior diplomat flagged it as culturally significant. Humans, he noted, describe themselves as dysfunctional without a particular compound. They consider this a normal, unremarkable fact about themselves. They discuss it casually, even humorously. The report made it up the chain and eventually landed somewhere near the king's desk. And apparently King Caelther Voss read it and found it. We were told the Voreth word, which Pelris translated with some difficulty, baffling in a way that required direct investigation. So he came to breakfast to find out if it was actually true that the humans who had, in 31 years, managed to expand their presence in this sector of the galaxy by approximately 300%, who had built a diplomatic network that now covered 42 independent civilizations, who had navigated a dozen near wars, and emerged from each of them having somehow made friends on both sides of the conflict. To find out if those humans actually could not function in the morning without a plant compound. And the answer turned out to be yes, basically yes. Some of them can manage, but many of them strongly prefer not to. I think what genuinely startled the king, what the coffee reaction opened up once the panic passed, was the realization that he had been thinking about human capability the wrong way. The Voreth model of capability is biological. You either have it or you don't. You are either built for the task or you are not. Humans are built to compensate, to augment, to find the thing that makes the gap smaller and use it, even if you don't fully understand it, even if it comes with a small measure of risk, even if it makes you dependent on something outside yourself. Coffee was a metaphor, not a planned one, but the universe sometimes hands you precisely the right metaphor at the precisely right moment. Testimony of Kaervoss, Junior Cultural Advisor to His Imperial Majesty, King Caelther Voss III. Recorded, May 5, 2387, 52 days after the incident. Note, this testimony was submitted in written form, translated by Pelris Tan, and verified by the Voreth Dominion Diplomatic Office. I am submitting this testimony at the request of the Galactic Diplomatic Oversight Bureau and with the permission of His Imperial Majesty. I am one of the few members of the delegation who was present throughout the incident and who has been authorized to speak about it from the Voreth perspective. I want to address several things that the human testimonies, comprehensive as they are, could not have captured. Internal things, Voreth things. When His Imperial Majesty took the first sip of coffee and experienced the response, his first thought, and I know this because I have served him for 17 years and I know his thinking, was not panic. His first thought was categorization. He felt something unexpected, and his mind immediately moved to classify it. He went through a rapid inventory of known substances that produce similar sensory signatures. The problem was the match. The signature matched Death Varus, not perfectly, but closely enough that the classification system flagged it as a priority possibility. Now, here is what the human testimonies have not said, because they could not know it. His Imperial Majesty has survived 2 actual assassination attempts in his reign. Both involved compounds administered in food or beverage. He has, as a result, a detailed and somewhat personal knowledge of the early symptom profiles of several toxins. When he set the cup down and spoke to physician Dreth Akavis, he was not certain. He was flagging a possibility that required immediate investigation. He maintained the absolute discipline that is expected of a Voreth sovereign: no dramatic action, no alarm, no accusation, because he was operating on a possibility, not a certainty. He had learned not to act on possibilities. What happened next, the human physician arriving, explaining, scanning, this he observed with great attention, not because he doubted her. He had assessed the room comprehensively when he entered, and he had made judgments about each individual in it. The xenobiologist's presentation and manner were consistent with someone telling the truth as they understood it. He observed with attention because he wanted to understand. He ran her explanation against what he was feeling. He checked the logic. The mechanism she described was coherent. The timeline she predicted, peak and then subsidence, was consistent with what his body was then doing. And then something happened that I think was unexpected for him. The subsidence came, the acute response peaked, and then, as predicted, it eased. And what was left behind was not a return to baseline. What was left was something slightly elevated, alert, clear. He described it to me afterward in private as, like standing on higher ground, not climbing, having arrived. He is not a being who uses that kind of language casually. He asked for the second cup because he wanted to understand the experience while in it, not in retrospect. That is how he investigates things. He goes toward them. I will tell you something else. The conversation with the xenobiologist, the 40 minutes about caffeine and human biology, and the coevolutionary history of stimulant plants. This was, in the 17 years I have known him, one of perhaps a dozen conversations I have seen genuinely capture his interest in real time. He was not performing attention. He was not being politely engaged. He was learning something that reordered a part of his model of the world. The specific thing that reordered it was not caffeine. It was the concept of what he described to me afterward as the deliberate incomplete. Humans, he said, are not fully optimized. They know they are not fully optimized. They have built a civilization on strategies for managing the gap between what they are and what they need to be. Coffee is one strategy. He learned about many others over the subsequent months of diplomatic contact. Tools, specialists, collaborative structures that compensate for individual limitation, medical interventions, sleep schedules engineered around biological rhythms, diet adjusted for performance. An entire infrastructure of optimization built not because humans are strong, but because they know exactly where they are weak. The Vorath, he said to me, the night after the breakfast, have spent 10,000 years being what we are. The humans have spent 10,000 years becoming more than what they are. These are not equivalent strategies. I asked him which strategy he thought was superior. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, I am sitting here having consumed a neurological agent I had never previously encountered, administered by a species I had considered beneath serious diplomatic engagement, in a facility that I thought was prepared for every contingency except the one that occurred, and I want more of it. He meant the coffee, but I do not think he meant only the coffee. Testimony of Dr. YUKITANAKA Final Entry. Recorded June 1, 2387. 3 months after the incident, I received a communication from the Vorath Dominion's Biochemical Research Division. They had conducted their analysis of the coffee we sent them. Comprehensive molecular breakdown, neurological response, mapping across a sample group of 43 Vorath volunteers. I have no idea how they recruited 43 Vorath volunteers to drink coffee in a laboratory setting, and I'm honestly a little afraid to ask. And a full comparative study against the death virus compound profile that had triggered the initial alarm. The study was brilliant. I don't say that as a courtesy. It was genuinely, rigorously excellent science. They had produced in 3 months what would have taken a human research team probably 3 years. Their conclusion regarding the death virus similarity. At a molecular level, one specific element of the caffeine molecule, a particular ring structure, produces a sensory signature that overlaps with the early death virus symptom profile in Vorath neurology. The overlap is approximately 43%, which is enough to trigger a threat recognition response in a Vorath who has never encountered caffeine before. It's essentially a false pattern match. The brain sees enough similarity to flag it as a possible match and wait for confirmation. They had also, and this is the part that made me sit very still for about 5 minutes, run the physiological data on His Imperial Majesty's response during the incident itself. And they had determined that his response was, by every measurable indicator, identical to the response of the 43 volunteers. No outliers, no complications. peak acute response at 2 minutes and 40 seconds, subsidence beginning at 3 minutes 15 seconds, return to slightly elevated baseline by 15 minutes. Normal, completely normal. He had had a completely normal caffeine response. Attached to the study was a personal note from the lead researcher. It said, "We have determined that His Majesty's initial response of alarm followed by continued investigation was, in retrospect, consistent with optimal VORETH threat response protocol. We are choosing to find this satisfying rather than embarrassing." I sent back a note that said, "For what it's worth, we find the same thing in humans. We call it healthy skepticism." The response came back, "We will add this to our documentation on human terminology." Testimony of Sergeant Elena Vasquez, final entry. About a year after the incident, I ran into Donovan in the embassy corridor. He had been promoted by that point. Chef Akafer had recognized that anyone who could maintain enough composure to pour a proper cup of coffee in the middle of an international diplomatic almost catastrophe probably deserved a raise. I asked him if he thought much about that morning. He said, "Every single day, every single time I make a pot." I said, "What do you think about?" He was quiet for a second, then he said, "I think about the fact that he drank it anyway. That's the part I can't get out of my head. He thought it might be poison, and then he found out it wasn't, and then he had another cup. What kind of person does that?" I thought about that. I said, probably the same kind of person who, 5,000 years ago, found a plant they'd never encountered, tried chewing on it, felt something strange, and then ground it up and boiled it in water to see if that would work better. Donovan laughed. "Yeah," he said, "maybe that's the thing, maybe that's always been the thing." Testimony of Ambassador Helena Marsh, final entry. The VORETH and humanity have been in ongoing diplomatic contact for just over a year now. We have 3 active working groups, 2 trade framework discussions in early stages, and 1 very interesting cultural exchange program that the King's office proposed, which involves, among other things, the establishment of a small human-style coffee service at the VORETH Imperial Court. I received a formal communication last week from the King's Protocol Office. It was procedural in nature, scheduling, logistics, nothing remarkable. At the very end, appended after the formal close, was a single additional line that was not protocol. It was personal. It read, "We have found that 2 cups is the correct amount. More than this, and our physician becomes very difficult to work with." I wrote back, "Agreed. Though some of our people have been known to push it to 4, we consider this a personal failing." The response, "Yes, this is consistent with our assessment of humans." I chose to take it as a compliment. The following passage is drawn from King Caelthar Vas III's address to the VORETH Imperial Council, delivered 37 days after the Nexus Station Velorath visit. It was shared with the human diplomatic corps at the request of the King himself, as an act of diplomatic transparency that, according to our senior analysts, has no precedent in 30 years of VORETH relations with any species. It is included here as a primary document. Translated from formal VORETH address format. Translation by Pelris Tan. Council members. I went to the human installation on Nexus Station Velorath to answer a question. The question was simple. Are humans actually as inconsistent as our data suggested? Are they actually a species that cannot optimize their own biology without external chemical assistance? Does this inconsistency explain their behavior, the aggression, the expansion, the constant activity that our intelligence assessments have never quite been able to model satisfactorily? I found an answer, but it was not the answer I expected to find. The humans gave me something to drink. It was a beverage from their home world. It is made from a plant. They consume it every morning. The compound in it activated my neurological system in a manner consistent with early death virus exposure, and for approximately 90 seconds I believed I had been poisoned. I want to be precise about what happened in those 90 seconds. The humans did not panic. The ambassador maintained direct visual contact with me, which, in our protocols, is a claim of status, and told me clearly without hesitation that I was safe in her room. She had no way of knowing whether that was true. She said it anyway. Their physician arrived and explained the situation with complete scientific accuracy. She had been wrong in her initial prediction of the compound's inertness, and she did not attempt to obscure this. She said she had been wrong, she explained why she had been wrong, and she told me what was actually happening. I drank a second cup. Council members, I want you to understand what that second cup was. It was not the response of a being who had stopped being careful. It was not impulsivity or foolishness. It was the response of a being who had gathered information, assessed it, concluded that the risk was understood and acceptable, and proceeded. It was, in other words, precisely what we would do. I have spent 31 years believing that the humans' inconsistency, their failure to optimize, their dependence on external augmentation, their chaotic and overlapping systems of redundancy and compensation, was a weakness, a fundamental biological and cultural limitation that placed them below the threshold of productive engagement. I was wrong. Their inconsistency is not a limitation, it is a strategy. They have built, across 5,000 years of documented history and undoubtedly much longer, an entire civilization based not on being sufficient as they are, but on being sufficient despite what they are. They are tired and they drink coffee. They are slow and they build machines that are faster. They are short-lived and they build institutions that last beyond any individual life. They are individually limited, and they build networks of individuals that compensate for any single limitation. They are, in every dimension, less than what they need to be, and they have, across millennia, built a civilization from the gap between what they are and what they need to be. I drank the second cup, because I decided the information I had gathered was sufficient to proceed. This is the same logic I use in every decision of consequence I make as sovereign. The humans do the same thing. They are not inconsistent, they are adaptive. I suggest we reconsider our position.